You grow careless, my king.
Death of a Game, Age of Conan. Death of a Game is a series in which I, nerdSlayer, take a look at games or companies that have died over the years and analyze the largest contributing factors and such. I will also talk about the legacy the said game or company left on the video game world. I classify a dead game as the following. A. It's actually dead. B. It had a sudden mass exodus of players and never recovered. And C. The game never launched or the company dissolved. So let this video serve as an investigation into why Age of Conan failed. And for some, it could be a trip down memory lane, whether positive or negative memories.
Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of your women. That is good. That is good.
That's where most people are familiar with the Conan universe. The Conan the Barbarian movie came out in 1982 and of course featured Arnold Schwarzenegger, who played, Conan the Cimmerian Barbarian. But the Conan universe has existed for around 76 years, counting today, and was created by Robert E. Howard back in 1934 in the form of a pulp magazine titled Weird Tales. Unfortunately, Robert E. Howard died shortly after, but had many stories published, including stories published as late as the 60s. Many other writers went on to write stories based in the same universe. Conan hadn't had so much representation in the video game world. The first game, titled Conan, came out in 1984 for the Commodore 64. Another game, also called Conan, was released for the PC, Xbox, GameCube, and PlayStation 2 in 2004, but in Europe only. The reason why this is relevant to Age of Conan, which was an MMO focused in the Conan universe, is that the MMO had serious shoes to fill. With tons of novels, books, and comics, and a very successful movie, when Funcom in 2005 announced a MMORPG in the Conan universe, hype was bursting at the seams. Especially with such lackluster previous game performances. Funcom was a Norwegian company, most known for their MMO Anarchy Online, and their adventure game The Longest Journey. Funcom had over 15 years of experience, starting back in 1994, with their string of Sega Genesis games. So when Funcom got their hands on the rights to make a Conan MMO, people were excited. As GameSpot put it, besides a strong focus on story, Age of Conan was to feature 7.1 surround audio and advanced graphics. As evidenced by the screenshots accompanying the release, the gameplay promised to be against the formulaic nature of online RPG combat at the time. Using a real combat engine and multi-point melee system, players would be able to target specific parts of their opponent's bodies. The game was delayed from its 2006 launch, however, and pushed to the first quarter of 2007. It was then delayed again until October 30th, 2007. The next delay came with news that Funcom, who were the developers of Age of Conan, would now be co-publishing the game with Eidos Interactive, who would be working on the box copy, as well as its rumored Xbox 360 console port, which never came to light. And that's a good thing, because even in the trailer and gameplay footage, the frame rate was utter garbage. Despite constant delays, hype was reaching astronomical levels as the game reached 500,000 beta signups, and was winning awards including Best MMO of E3 in 2007. Funcom also had created a very popular forum for the game that was rife with very large gaming communities who were eager to dive into the game as soon as possible. Of course, more delays came, and those who were able to play the game in beta knew that this was okay. The game was still far too unfinished to release yet, to which the CEO of Funcom at the time, Trond Aas, agreed. So more delays followed, but Age of Conan finally released on May 20th, 2008. Age of Conan's forums were boasting 700,000 signups, and when the game launched, it was able to sell 500,000 copies in a mere week. This was something Funcom desperately needed as their shares were dropping due to constant delays. Funcom was selling so many Age of Conan games that they frankly were unable to meet the supply in some cases. A few weeks later, Age of Conan had already reached the 1 million sales threshold. This made it, at the time, the best-selling MMO since World of Warcraft. Hype was incredible, and critics were positive about the game, They enjoyed the strong lore present, fresh new action combat system, and incredible graphics. But critics early on would nearly always respond positively to a game with great ideas and a fun early game experience. But sticking through that to see if the game can stay consistent is something the actual players of the game are frankly in charge of. And those players weren't so positive about the game, at least not after their initial excitements wore off. Sure, the early parts of the game were incredible, what with what some people saw as a strong graphic presentation, fun and exciting combat, and a featured voice-acted storyline and fun quests.
So then, you're not quite dead. This is Tortage, the pirate haven, jewel of the Barachian Isles. To the west is Atlantis, silent and dead under the open ocean. Eastwards lies Hyboria, where the world's doom rises. But your life is ending, even as I speak.
But issues were abundant in the form of server crashes, lack of in-game content, missing features that were promised previously, and performance issues. Most notably being the debilitating memory leak, which after a certain amount of time playing inevitably would crash your client. Graphics at the time were surely incredible, but not very optimized for the less than stellar PCs. PvP warfare was fun, thanks in part to the fun classes in combat, but there was no penalties for ganking people, and sieges had game-breaking bugs that made it to where attacking a clan-owned keep was nearly impossible. Not to mention that the keeps were frankly useless, they were just props. The first 20 levels, as I mentioned above in Tortage, were great fun. The first time. When you wanted to make an alt, you had to go through the same thing over and over again with no difference in story. And after the first 20 levels ended, you were dropped off in another instance zone with large gaps between quest content which encouraged and frankly required mob grinding. In some cases, a 15 to 20 level grind. This was a jarring effect. It was the equivalent of a night at a full-service 5-star hotel, waking up in the desert with nobody except a few squirrels in sight. Bugs were abundant as well. People were falling through the world and being one-shot by bugged mobs. It was also proving difficult to even complete some areas of the minuscule amount of content at launch period due to the bugs. On August 2008, a few months after the launch of the game, the game director, Godager, announced he would be leaving Funcom. I probably butchered that name. Anyway, he was leaving the company and cited that his dissatisfaction with Age of Conan and its launch was the main reason. He was then replaced by the game director Craig Morrison, who had served as Anarchy Online's game director. Godager had this to say upon his exit. "I have done my very best making this fabulous game, but I have concluded there are elements which I am dissatisfied with. I have decided to act on this, and as a result, I have chosen to leave Funcom. It is time to get a new, fresh eyes on Age of Conan, and I wholeheartedly support the appointment of Craig. I have had a fantastic time these last 16 years, and I am very proud of the things that Funcom has achieved. Funcom and Conan will always be a big part of me, but as I look to new ventures outside the gaming industry, I am certain Age of Conan's future is in the best of hands." Now, whether or not he truly took this exit on his own accord, we don't really know, but we can't put it past a company to urge a director to leave a company, as this is something quite common in corporate environments. Fixes for a majority of the bugs were slow to come out, but on October 2009, an update came out that added a notoriety system which helped clamp down on the rampant griefing by giving players alignments. They also added Ymir's Pass, which was a mid-level new area that added more leveling content and a PvE dungeon. April 2009 finally saw the introduction of PvP leveling ranks, which had been teased back in July 2008 and had taken more than half a year to implement. June of 2009, Update 5 was launched with what added a new high-level zone titled Tarantia Commons. This was an area for level 75 plus content. The same patch also came with gem changes, class balancing, and etc. Update 6, which launched in December of 2009, actually made keeps useful, as you could now build things inside of them with the newly introduced Renown system. This is a good change because, as previously noted, the keeps served nothing more than a prop for clans, which led to many of the clans who owned these keeps to quitting the game. According to the website MMORPG, Age of Conan was making enough fixes and updates to qualify for being the most improved MMO of 2009, though it's hard to know how much that really meant, since when reading things like Funcom has launched over 5 massive free updates to Age of Conan since the launch in 2008, reads like an ad to me, than more of an article of substance. It was hard to tell if the consistent updates Funcom was introducing were going to lead to recovering some of the population that had quit in 2008, because the difference between a player quitting and stopping their play is rather huge, as people who quit a game usually do so in disgust or full of emotion. That player's not going to come back to the game, rarely if ever. This is why MMOs have hardly ever had significant comebacks in population. It didn't help things that the players of the game were criticizing the seesawing of balance issues, which one week made one class the apex predator and the next the gunk you wipe off your shoes. Despite any of this, however, on August 18th, 2009, Funcom announced their first upcoming expansion, Rise of the Godslayer, which was set to launch in 2010. It officially launched on May 11th, 2010, and as the GameSpy article explained, there's no raise level cap in Rise of the Godslayer. There is a new continent, the Asian-themed Katai, which comes with a new player race, the Khitan, but it contains lower level content for level 20 up, as well as high level challenge. There are no new classes, no more levels, but there is an alternate advancement system that will broaden the range of existing classes, as well as increase its power. There isn't just more stuff to do, but there's a greater variety of it, raising wolves and tigers from cubs to fighting companions to mounts, and taking sides in factional struggles. This was much needed content injected into the earlier levels of the game, as well as giving the max level players something to chew on as well. These new zones came with the new dungeons and raids, and the expansion added more class diversity in the form of popular skill trees at the time. But this was over 2 years after the launch of the game. Had the expansion came far too late? Since we don't have access to population numbers, we only have Funcom's publicly traded stock to gauge the success of the company and the game. And if Funcom's stock was any measure of success of Age of Conan, the company and the game weren't doing very well between 2009 and 2011. The Xbox 360 release that was mentioned prior to launch was still nowhere in sight despite Funcom continuously saying otherwise. As 2011 came closer, Funcom had decided to keep its game afloat. They were going to have to try a different business direction. A business direction that was following other trends present at the time. Freemium. Funcom had decided to take their game freemium, which meant it allowed for a free-to-play but placed heavy restrictions on you in order to play the game that way, on par with SWTOR of the current date and Lotro of back then. This meant playing the game free wasn't really an option for many, especially those who didn't want to intentionally gimp themselves just to play it for free. Free-to-play switches are rarely seen as a good sign, and hardly any MMOs have found success with them. Free-to-play switches seem to mark the switch between an MMO to more of an online RPG. This much was true with Age of Conan, now dubbed Age of Conan Unchained. As population dwindled, Funcom had transitioned the game away from the massive multiplayer and focused more on the single-player content more akin to Lord of the Rings Online or SWTOR. Premium got you bonus token gains, loyalty rewards, bonus XP, 30% bonus XP in fact, and a 30% bonus faction gain. It doubled rewards from your Unchained caches, which, well, we can already guess what those are. This brings me back to my gripe on Global Agenda's business model in my Death of a Game on Global Agenda. Allowing you to play free and then strongly urging you to pay is not really the same as free to play. Especially when, unlike Lotro's business model, Age of Conan expected you to either pay the premium price for the premium content, or you wouldn't get it, period, while Lotro and City of Heroes allowed you to purchase individual parts of the content. Financial reports at the time have been hard to get a hold of, but if you take a look at Funcom's stock, they have been mostly downtrending between 2010 and 2011. The spike in 2012 happens due to the launch of their other MMO, The Secret World, which frankly also didn't do very well. Maybe that's another video. You might be able to say that Funcom is incompetent, but you can't fault them for being a quitter. They didn't quit despite their negative results with Age of Conan, and the Savage Coast of Turin adventure pack was proof as such. August 31st, 2011, the pack was launched. Funcom had finally caught up to its contemporaries and was offering a content expansion that was able to be bought separately with Funcom points and didn't require a membership to play if you did so. The new content was aimed to launch along with the 2011 film Conan the Barbarian, so that players had the chance to see some of the characters' armor and weapons from the film. In terms of the review of that pack, well, a writer on MMO games put it this way: the lack of compelling story narrative, coherent quest chains, voice dialogue, engaging PvP and siege content, and their stubborn resistance against adding additional levels and content to experience them has left me with a sour taste and unhappiness. I'm sure there are perfectly good explanations to most of my issues here, but I haven't been able to find any of them. Age of Conan is still a magnificent game, and I still recommend it to another player. However, unless you've been playing for a while and are desperate for new content, I'd recommend looking to the adventure packs only as a last resort. There are plenty of content in the original game, and it's all much better anyway. So it didn't look like the rebirth for Conan was coming anytime soon. 2 years after going free to play, Age of Conan finally managed to get on Steam. It's at this point that we are able to fairly easily track the population of the game, and the numbers weren't very good. In 2013, the game peaked at 1,276 players playing at one time. This is concurrently, reaching as low as 294 players peak. 2014, the numbers were worse, peaking at 342 players and hitting as low as 137 players. If anything, it seemed like the going to Steam didn't really seem to help the company very much. In 2016, Funcom was bailed out by the Norwegian government when they were facing bankruptcy. As of February 12, 2017, Funcom, in their most recent financial analysis, has determined they will no longer be able to support Age of Conan or any further updates on the game. But although death is likely in the future for the troubled Age of Conan MMO, the Conan world is still very much thriving. In 2017, Funcom was able to launch a Conan survival game titled Conan Exiles. Conan Exiles launched as an early access title, which allows them to essentially get away with launching unfinished and then being funded in the meantime. That sounds a bit harsh, but it's true. I'm sure Age of Conan would have done much better if it was able to launch in some sort of early access fashion. Conan Exiles, despite its mixed reviews, rescued Funcom from its certain death as a company, as the article states. Funcom devoted a significant slice of its recent financial briefing to Conan Exiles. Funcom said that Conan Exiles attracted 480,000 sales in its first 28 days on sale, up from 320,000 just over 2 weeks ago. It's expected to have reached Funcom's initial 12-month sales goals of 487,000 copies by the end of just its first 30 days. Conan Exiles has recovered its $4.5 million development cost to date within 7 days of release. Now, whether or not this is a positive to you based on your feelings of their handling of Age of Conan or their other 2 MMO titles, at least this means that the Conan universe continues to live on. So why did Age of Conan fail? The Conan universe is large, and its long age and support is proof to this. But was it just not destined for the world of an MMO? In this next section, we will outline the largest contributing factors to the failure of Age of Conan. But first, in order to understand the legacy Age of Conan left on the gaming world, let's talk about what Age of Conan did well. Soundtrack and lore. Knut A. Hagen outdid himself. Because talk about a masterpiece of sound. When you first load into the game, your senses are attacked by a fast-paced track that gets the blood flowing. But in the more subtle moments, like exploring the beaches or cities, you have this sort of suspicious sounding track, almost as if the game is suggesting that something is going to happen. And then bam, the drums or horns come in, and you have the battle soundtrack. The great sound didn't come as a surprise to old fans of Funcom because involved in the sound design for Age of Conan was Simon Poole, who did Dreamfall Longest Journey, which, in my opinion, has one of the best soundtracks ever. Couple this with the extensive lore that spanned back over 70 years across multiple books, comics, and full-length movies, and you have an ambience that grabs a hold of you and puts you right in the thick of the Conan universe. The roleplay community was notable in Age of Conan. I remember entire guilds being dedicated to it at launch and even soon after. Without a question, you can say that a great soundtrack and strong lore contributed to having such a strong role-playing presence. Too bad for most, it wasn't worth it enough to slog through the unfinished product that was Age of Conan. Story and voice acting. This is a small point, but it's an important one for me to point out. SWTOR, upon its launch in 2011, bragged that it was the first fully voiced MMO, and they were right in that claim. But it's easy to forget that Age of Conan, which came out in 2008, had a fully voiced first 20 levels of the story. This is incredibly impressive, especially if you look at its contemporaries like Tabula Rasa and Warhammer, which launched at similar times but had little to no voice-acted storylines or quests.
A friendly face among so much ugliness. Free me, I beg you. Those brutes set upon me in a park less than an hour ago and ran me down as I fled. Animals. Cut through iron chains? Are you mad? You need a key. The scavenger has the key. He's a petty raider captain from Tortage. He and his small gang are nearby. Slit that bastard's throat and loot his corpse. Please. Please, hurry. He's on the beach picking through the bones of the sunken ship.
Age of Conan was a revolutionary MMO in this sense. However, in an interesting way, this was almost detrimental towards Age of Conan. After those 20 levels ended, you were dropped in a near contentless zone and expected to grind up to max level, which was 60 levels later, no voice acting, and no guided story. Visceral combat. While I personally feel the combat of Age of Conan is a tad overrated, that's mainly because it's a game unlike other MMOs I have covered that the gameplay didn't stand the test of time. Still, you have to look at the combat the game had for the time it came out. 2008 was WoW at its full momentum, and Warhammer Online was also around and about. Age of Conan was a breath of fresh air with its action-based combat system. While the blocking system was a bit odd to say the least, but it was still very much an attempt at mixing a action-based combat system with an MMO. What really set the game apart with the combat though was its brutal executions. Yes, in Conan fashion you could dismember people, chop someone down, or even shock and flame them to death. This even worked on other players, which made the feeling of killing a player that much more rewarding. You also had combo change, which is something you see Blade and Soul make rather popular rather recently in the MMO world as well. Each class had their own form of combos, and these combos would do more damage when fully completed, making the gameplay feel more like an action game than an MMO. Sadly, casters in most cases were relegated to spamming the same nukes over and over, like the players were used to in World of Warcraft. Now, yes, I disliked how the game engine made your character feel like 1,000 pounds, but even with all of these issues, there's just nothing like those split moments where you had the execution animations occur, and you really felt like you just barely got out of that fight based on your skill or your movement or your ability chaining. So now that we understand the positives of Age of Conan, we can better appreciate the legacy it left. Let's talk now about the largest contributing factors that led to the game's ultimate death. Funcommed, or failure to deliver. Now this is usually the part of the video where we reference the rushed launch and promised features never coming to fruition or coming too slowly and overhype contributing to the death of the game, and those are certainly factors here, but I specifically attribute this to Funcomming simply because it seems to be a habit of theirs, especially the way that they continuously keep doing it. Funcom has the approach where they acknowledge the more obvious issues with their games, i.e. performance and bugs, but fail to acknowledge how woefully unfinished the projects are. Take this interview done on MTV. I know, MTV handled video games? Anyway, take this interview as an example. I think it's okay to say that we simply didn't deliver as good as we should have on all of the launch features. That said, I do think we went out of the gate with some extremely strong ones too. Combat, graphics, presentation, audio, maturity, story and quests, tortage, etc., which made us a giga hit in retail and gave us some great reviews. But on other features, we just didn't polish it well enough, including our items, trade skill, system performance, and PvP. Items and PvP? What about the titanic gaps in progression after Tortage, the starter area? What about the promised DX10 not even being implemented into the game? Don't worry guys, Funcom had this to say in response. Sometimes when you take an idea from concept and plans on paper to balance in the game, it just doesn't fit, or causes too many other issues. In those cases, it's actually better that we cut them. Those were informed decisions in the best interest of the overall player experience. So the cut content, or frankly unfinished content, we can just chalk that up to having been better cut than implemented, period. And don't even get me started on the Xbox 360 launch, which they continued to tell people that was coming, and shockingly, never did. Another example was when Anarchy Online launched in 2001. They told review companies to hold off on reviewing the game until they fixed launch issues. Oh, lordy. Oh, yes, don't review the car that I just gave you. The wheels don't quite work yet. Funcom then promises extensive post-launch support, which they always follow up with, but is often too slow-moving for the people who already expected a much more completed project. You saw this with The Secret World, and some people suspect the same thing with their newly launched survival game, Conan Exiles. This was no different for Age of Conan, which before launch had nearly 1 million people signed up on the forums and was delayed almost a dozen different times. Hype certainly was at astronomical levels, but when you keep promising the mob outside your house with the shiny toys, it's no mystery that when they don't receive those things, the riots follow. It becomes less of a, well, the game's just unfinished, but we're gonna stick it through, and more of a, well, they kind of lied blatantly and excluded the content that they promised would be included. Not to mention the content people expected the game to have, like a streamlined 20 to 80 leveling system, wasn't fully implemented until almost a year after the launch of the game. You have to remember, many people consider the first month or two to be the most important for an MMO and its longevity in the market. 6 months or more is just not going to cut it. It might seem like I'm singling out Funcom specifically on this issue, but it just so happens that I frankly get exhausted with the whole pleading ignorance defense or making excuses defense that they are ever so fond of. The lead designer of the game probably was tired of this too, which is probably why he quit the company. That's a little bit of conjecture on my part, but bear with me. Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 proved that in order to regain an audience's trust, you need to admit your mistakes and take it on the chin. But that's part of the issue with Funcom. The other part is that they simply launch game engines that seem like they're years behind the curve, which is probably attributed to the sheer amount of delays that they encounter in their development cycle. Which lead me to my next issue. Bugs and performance issues. Now, bugs and performance issues in Age of Conan were so bad that they deserve their own category. The most notable bug the game experienced, that continued to experience even a year after launch, was the dreaded memory leak. No matter how expensive or how impressive your PC was, after playing Age of Conan for a certain amount of time, the game would reach a max memory limit and crash you. For some, this happened almost every 30 minutes to an hour, and for others, as frequent as a new Yahoo Kardashian family article. Ugh. One of the other most infamous bugs was the polearm guardian who was able to one-shot other players. Again, this remained in the game for far too long for its own good. One of the more hilarious bugs that was evident at launch was the female characters attacking slower than male characters. Yes, playing a female character to get to witness those glorious boobies that everybody wants to witness, if you will, meant that you were nerfing yourself, so you were trading boobies for attack speed. But then again, there's just tons of other bugs that were present in the game. Just look at this little highlight reel for an example. Now, as per performance issues, if you had an ATI card, which many people did, good luck running the game at an adequate FPS. And because of a lack of FPS, this meant that you had to play the game at lower graphics, which weren't very flattering in Age of Conan. Now, bugs aren't exactly new to game launches, but the sheer amount of them that existed in Age of Conan went unfixed for such a long time is just staggering. Today, as of 3/14/2017, I attempted to add a premium membership to my old Age of Conan account, and the interface bugged out and wouldn't even let me use their in-game shop. When I went to their website to try and do it there, the website crashed and I was forced to wait another day. Finally, I log on to the next day and try to add the premium status again so I can get some higher level footage, and sure enough, it didn't work. Almost 10 years after launch, and they're still having issues? But that could have something to do with their poor track record of actually changing things. Which brings me to my next reason. Teeter-totter-like balancing. Now sure, I was just criticizing them for their lack of bug fixes and performance fixes, but even when Funcom did try and balance the game or fix bugs, they ended up making the game worse. The amount of teeter-totter balancing, if you will, back and forth, and one thing is godly and the next thing is terrible, was just incredible. For some time, the game had casters being the gods of the game, PvP especially. They could CC lock a player and burn him before he even got anywhere close to touching them with his melee weapon. And when that got boring, they flipped the balancing on its head and made the Guardian the most overpowered melee class in the game. Poor Dark Templars. When you already have a volatile player base who isn't exactly happy with your current product, poking the nerf bat around in seemingly random directions wherever you see smoke, aka whining players on the forum, this leads to poor decision making when it comes to balance changes. The conclusion. After listening to the reasons I outlined for the failure of Age of Conan, you should have a better understanding of why the game is dying, or is soon to be dead. I think it's worth mentioning that you should ignore people who say things like, the Conan universe isn't meant for an MMO, or that nudity or gore contributed to its failure. It's like people have selective hearing in that respect because the game sold over 1 million copies. I think it did just fine with nudity in the Conan universe. It's heartbreaking for some when the game manages to make a number of revisions and changes to the game, but still manages to end up failing in the end. That's because MMO players are very unforgiving, and rightfully so in most cases. MMO time investments are the highest out of any game, even as a casual player. And when players get burnt after putting all their time and money into an MMO, it's not surprising when they leave and never want to give the game another chance. That's why the list of MMOs that have been able to make a comeback, I can probably count on one hand. But at least the Conan universe isn't done in terms of its potential in the gaming market. With Conan Exiles out there doing incredibly financially well, maybe there's some hope for the Conan universe. Though a quick glance at the review of the game, and it looks like the same old from Funcom. Fun concept with incomplete features and a buggy engine. And yes, there's still a memory leak. Thanks for watching the video, guys, and feel free to like it if you did like the video, and if you had some thoughts or possibly agreed or disagreed, you can voice so in the comments below. If you want to see more pseudo-journalism content like this or other video game focused analyses, subscribe to my channel. My social media links are in the description and on screen. I also linked the Discord channel, which is a free place to join and talk about video games with other passionate fans and gamers. We also have weekly debate topics where people can just share their feelings or thoughts on, well, whatever the topic is for the time. My Patreon link is also in the description and on screen, and feel free to drop your suggestions for a next video on the Discord or in the YouTube comments. I want to use this time to thank the current patrons that I've had, and frankly that I've had since I started my Patreon account. Happy Teabag, Trivial, Rum, Dog Runes. There's a few other guys that I don't want to name because they only have their personal names on here. But thanks to you guys too, you know who you are. That's all I have for you guys. Look for the next video to come out sometime next week, where I will have an exclusive interview with Richard Garriott, the creator of Ultima Online and Tabula Rasa. The video, of course, will be Death of a Game, Tabula Rasa.